Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's special event. I'm Anthony Painter. I'm Director of the Independent Review of the Police Federation, which is housed here at the RSA, and I'm also author of a book called Left Without a Future, Social Justice in Anxious Times. Just before we begin, can I ask you to make sure your mobile phones are switched off or to silent. We're live streaming tonight's event as usual, so welcome to all our web viewers. And a reminder that the hashtag is #RSA Unger if you want to get involved with the discussion on Twitter, either in the room or outside. Now, with the housekeeping notices over, it really is my very great pleasure to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker. Robert Mangabeira Unger is an internationally influential social, legal and political theorist and philosopher. A former Minister of Strategic Affairs in the Brazilian government, he's a prolific author of works of legal, political and economic thought, social theory and philosophy, in which he develops a profound theory of self and society. As a Roscoe Pound Professor of Law at Harvard University, he has taught many of the US and world elite, including President Barack Obama. But this barely touches the surface of a life's work with remarkable scope and coherence. There are many different routes into Professor Unger's work. My own came as I was writing Left Without a Future. I was on the lookout for ideas that could be of use in the search for greater social justice. These ideas had to move beyond, even challenge, the orthodoxies of Keynesian social democracy, populist socialism, as well as the ideological domination of the liberal right. Professor Unger's ideas, as we will hear, are radical and pragmatic, urgent, deeply human, neither utopian nor trivial, grounded in pluralism, albeit qualified, and they agitate for deep freedom and democracy, and they challenge the political and ideological orthodoxies of our time. That's what intrigued me back then and since, and that's why I think this lecture and the work that underpins it is so important if we genuinely want to map out a better economy, a deepened democracy, and a richly collaborative society. We're really delighted that you've returned to us here at the RSA. Roberto, over to you. We very much look forward to hearing your thoughts.
What is structural change? And what kind of structural change do we need? I propose to address these two questions by an argument in 4 steps. First, I ask, what is structural change? Second, I suggest the roots of the idea of structural change in the history of social thought, and the task of the reconstruction of social thought so that it can enable us to imagine structural change in the future. Third, I seek to answer the second question. What structural change do we need? From the bottom up, short term, and from the top down, long term. And finally, I discuss the relation of the idea of structural change to our most intimate human concerns. The idea of structural change. The regimes of society are not like natural phenomena. They are frozen politics. The organization of society arises as the result of the temporary containment and relative interruption of our struggle, of our practical and visionary struggle over the terms of our access to one another. Social structures are simply frozen human activity that comes back to us as if it were an alien fate. and acquires the mendacious semblance of naturalness, necessity, and authority. The true object of transformative thinking and transformative politics in the world is the mastery and the change of structure. Now, by that standard, there is today almost no progressive politics in the world. Today, the progressives appear on the stage of history as the humanizers of the inevitable. They have no program. Their program is the program of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. Today, the right are supposedly those who accord priority to freedom, and the left, those who give priority to equality within the framework of the established arrangements and assumptions. If we once again became willing to challenge and to change these assumptions and arrangements, we would understand that the true goal of the progressives must be now, as it was in the 19th century, a larger life for the ordinary man and woman. And the struggle against entrenched inequality is subsidiary to that larger goal. If the goal is to lift ordinary people up to a higher plane of intensity, scope, and capability, the instrument for the prosecution of that goal is the cumulative transformation of the structure of society. Nothing is more important than structural change. Our ideals and our interests remain always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them in fact. Underlying this idea of the primacy of structural change is a metaphysical conception of our humanity. We are shaped by the context of society and of culture that we build and inhabit. To a very large extent, they make us who we are. Nevertheless, there is always more in us, in each of us individually, as well as in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in them. They are finite with regard to us, and we are infinite with respect to them. We cannot fully respect one another unless we disrespect them, denying them the last word and keeping it for ourselves. Now, a complication arises in our relation to the problem of structure. The complication is that in addition to being able to change the structures, we can also change, indeed we must change, the sense in which they are just there, beyond the scope of our power of revision. Society and culture may be so arranged as either to extend or to narrow the distance between the ordinary activities that we undertake within a framework that we take for granted and the exceptional activities by which, typically under the provocation of crisis, we change and challenge pieces of this framework. Our interest is to narrow this distance. To narrow this distance so that we can engage in a social world without surrendering to it. And this interest, this interest in our freedom to be insiders and outsiders at the same time, is intimately connected with our material interest in the development of our powers of production and our moral interest in the overcoming of entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy. The liberals and socialists of the 19th century were inclined to believe that there was a pre-established harmony, a natural convergence between the advancement of our material interests in the development of our productive powers and our moral interests in human liberation. We can no longer share that faith and risk then embracing the equally dogmatic inversion of this faith, the belief in an insoluble contradiction between our material and moral interests. The truth is that there is always a zone of intersection between the arrangements that can promote our material interests and the arrangements that can favor our moral ones. An attribute of the institutions and practices to be developed in this zone of intersection is that they lend themselves to revision, that they be corrigible, that they allow us to engage without surrendering. Now I come to the second part of my remarks, the roots of the problem of structure and of the idea of structure in the history of social thought. The conception that the regimes of society are made and imagined was the central revolutionary insight in classical European social theory. This conception, however, as soon as it was enunciated, was also circumscribed and eviscerated by a series of necessitarian assumptions, of determinisms, of surrenders to fate and to fatefulness. The first of these assumptions was the idea that there is a closed list of alternative forms of social organization in history, like the modes of production in Marxism. And together with this idea goes the notion that there is an objective logic of group or class interests. Now, the truth is just the opposite. The more that conflict over the terms of social life escalates, the more it becomes clear that the question, what are my interests by virtue of belonging to a certain group or class, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the social alternatives? And who would I become under those alternatives, and what then would my interests be? The second necessitarian assumption was the idea that each of these systems was an indivisible whole. And from this idea, there followed a poisonous implication for the understanding of politics. Namely, that in politics we must choose between the revolutionary substitution of one system for another and the reformist management of an established system. On the contrary, the primary mode of transformative politics is radical reform, the piecemeal transformation of the structure that may nevertheless become radical in outcome if cumulatively pursued under a certain conception. The third necessitarian assumption was the idea that there are laws of historical change governing the succession of such systems in history. There are no such laws. If there were such laws, programmatic thinking, the imagination of the adjacent possible, would have no role. What then has happened in contemporary social science? The necessitarian assumptions have been rejected only because the structural idea with which they were associated has also been abandoned. Our task is therefore to rescue the radical conception lying at the center of classical European social theory from the incubus of the necessitarian illusions. In the absence of the execution of that task, what prevails across the whole field of the humanities and social sciences are rationalizing, humanizing, and escapist tendencies. In the hard social sciences, beginning with economics, the rationalization of the existent, a right-wing Hegelianism. In the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory, a humanizing gloss on the established regimes, a pseudo-philosophical prop to the ameliorative practices of compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer and the idealization of law. And in the humanities, escapism. We embark on a roller coaster of subjective adventurism disconnected from the reimagination and the remaking of society. The votaries of these rationalizing, humanizing, and escapist tendencies profess to be enemies. In fact, they are allies in the disarmament of the transformative will and imagination. Now I proceed to the third step of my argument. What kind of structural change do we then need? I answer this question in two impulses. First, from the top down and long term, and then from the bottom up and short term. From the top down and long term, the general conception of the direction. Here are three equivalent formulations. The first formulation is that we need structural change, but unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, cannot bring ourselves to subscribe to a definitive institutional blueprint. How can we acquire the imagination of structural change without falling into structural dogmatism? Through a series of innovations designed to radicalize and generalize the experimentalist impulse in every domain of society and of culture. A second formulation is to understand the objective. The objective of the progressives, of the transformers. The objective is to raise the ordinary lives of ordinary people to a higher plane, to a greater scope, to a larger capability. And the instrument of this shared bigness is the cumulative structural transformation of society. To the contest between the market and the state, there succeeds a contest over the alternative institutional forms of the market economy, democratic politics, and independent civil society. The third formulation of this larger objective has to do with the relation that should be established between two competing goals for the progressives. One goal has to do with the defense of the majority against economic insecurity, with the historical fear of dispossession But if this were the only goal of the progressives would have no more than a defensive or negative agenda. The other set of interests to which they should be devoted has to do with energy, with creativity, with innovation for the majority. Whichever political force can most persuasively embody the cause of vitality commands the agenda of politics. And because the conservatives have more plausibly embodied this cause than their progressive opponents, it is they who now, for the most part, in most of the world, command the agenda. If these two sets of interests are to be reconciled against the unchallenged background of social life, the structure, what we get is the Nordic model, or the third way, the hegemonic project of the North Atlantic elites today, to reconcile American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection against the background of largely unchanged regimes of economic, political, and social life. If, however, we seek to reconcile these objectives, refusing to hold the institutional background constant, but on the contrary, subjecting it to challenge and revision, we get something entirely different. What then do we get? In the domain of economic life, we get a radically democratized market economy. A market economy that is not fastened to a single version of itself, but supports alternative regimes of private and social property. A market economy in which a much larger segment of the labor force gains access to the advanced sectors of production, to the revolutionary form of economic vanguardism, of production as innovation that is emerging in the world in the wake of the decline of traditional mass production. A market economy in which economically dependent wage labor will gradually give way to self-employment and cooperation as the superior forms of free labor. And a market economy in which no human being will be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. Everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in a formula and then embody the formula in a physical contraption. The purpose of the machine is to do everything that we have learned how to repeat, so that our supreme resource, in a sense our only resource, our time, can be preserved for the not yet repeatable. And in the domain of political life, what this goal entails is a high-energy democracy. A democracy that raises the temperature and hastens the pace of politics, and that multiplies occasions for the creation of counter-models of the future in different localities and sectors, so that devolution becomes the complement rather than the contradiction of strong central direction. Such a high-energy democracy is capable of mastering the structure, of undermining the power of the dead over the living, and of diminishing the dependence of change upon crisis. Now consider this question: what kind of structural change do we need? From the bottom up and from the short or medium term. The basic problems of the rich North Atlantic democracies can no longer be solved or even addressed within the limits of the social democratic compromise of the mid-20th century. I cite 5 such problems, and sketch the general direction of a response to them beyond the limits of that compromise. First, beginning from what is relatively more familiar, the provision of public goods. Public goods like education and health make people. The state must provide a universal minimum at the floor of the provision of social services and operate at the ceiling, developing the costliest and most complicated services. But in the broad middle range between the floor and the ceiling, the state can and should engage, prepare, equip, and finance independent civil society so that it can participate not for profit in the experimental and competitive provision of public services as the best way of enhancing their quality and of provoking the independent organization of civil society outside the state. The second problem is the relation of finance to the real economy. Under the existing economic systems, production is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And the productive potential of the vast amount of capital accumulated in the banks and stock markets goes largely wasted. Finance can be a good servant, but it is a bad master. And we need a series of institutional changes and tax and regulatory changes that would mandatorily enlist finance in the service of the productive agenda of society. The third problem is the hierarchical segmentation of the economy. A new form of economic life emerges around the world, of vanguardism, of advanced experimentalism, confined, however, to sectors weakly linked to the rest of the national economy, with the vast majority of the labor force excluded from them. And what we want is to disseminate these advanced practices. To achieve that goal, we must innovate in the arrangements that associate the state with small and medium-sized firms, and that allow these small and medium-sized firms to associate with one another, cooperating and competing at the same time. The fourth problem is the practical basis of social solidarity. Money transfers organized by the state are not adequate as a basis for social solidarity, especially when the ethnic and cultural homogeneity of the society declines. The only adequate basis of social solidarity is direct responsibility to take care of other people beyond the boundaries of one's own family. And the fifth problem is that in the existing flawed and relative democracies, the low-energy democracies that we have, change continues to depend upon crisis, historically in the form of war and ruin. What we want is change without crisis, and for that we need high-energy democracies. Democracies that promote a high level of engagement, that resolve impasse quickly, and that combine democratic centralism with democratic devolution, that is to say, with countermodels of the future. Now, the following difficulty arises. These changes that I have defended are designed to make transformation less dependent upon trauma. It seems, however, that they themselves require trauma to be established. Thus comes the role of the imagination. The task of the imagination is to do the work of crisis without crisis. I now come to the final step, the fourth step in my intervention. the relation of these political ideas to our personal concerns. None of these political proposals can advance in the world unless they resonate with our intimate anxieties. I cite only one of them. We all, as we grow older, risk succumbing to the marriage of the hardened version of the self, the character, with the compromises of our circumstance. A mummy begins to form around each of us, and within that mummy we die many small deaths. To come more fully into the possession of our supreme good, life, we must break out of that mummy. We must tear the mummy apart for the sake of life. These political proposals must draw meaning and authority from their association with this intimate concern. The political proposals are animated by an idea of vitality and communicate with the good of life presented to each of us. I can now answer the question, what kind of structural change do we need? I argue that this question has two answers, and that although these two answers may in fact seem to be entirely different, they are in fact the same. The first answer is we need the kind of structural change that can address the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies left unsolved and even unaddressed by the social democratic compromise of the past century. The second answer is that we need the kind of structural change that can enable us to be more human by becoming more godlike, which is to say, more lifelike. So lifelike that each of us can die only once.
That was a formidable combination of philosophy, social and political theory. And you look at a number of themes that you pick up in your book, The Self Awakened, which clearly is a key philosophical text. What I found very interesting about the talk in particular was this contrast, if you like, this historical contrast between an awakening that happened in the 18th and 19th century and then a slumber. And the first question is, how did we end up in this slumber? And what is, forgive the phrase, a revolutionary class that will help us to awaken from that slumber?
So, part of the answer is that democracies have been organized in the contemporary world in a way that leaves the structure, the theme of this talk, unchallenged, except when the would-be transformers have wars and economic collapse as their allies. And so look at the fundamental rhythm of European life over the long 20th century. In their wars, when they are slaughtering one another, the Europeans wake up. They wake up to the terrible devotions of war. Life seems to be bigger, and structural change ineluctably follows the conflict. Then, in peace, they drown their sorrows in consumption and go back to sleep. under the instruction of philosophers, politicians, and entertainers who promote the poisonous doctrine that there are no alternatives in the world. This is the fundamental problem, and it is a form of political and spiritual servitude against which we must rebel. That idea was really the subtext of the argument that I have just presented to you.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. Is there anywhere that you've observed where you can see the beginnings of some of these ideas become a reality? Something, somewhere, some group, a social movement, a group of people, a country that fills you with a degree of hope?
All over the world, not in one place, in one country, in one class, as the Marxists used to think, but all over the world there are thousands, there are millions of these little epiphanies. This vast Brownian motion, this restlessness. The world is restless under the yoke of the dictatorship of no alternatives. But all this multitude of small-scale innovations fails to have its transformative potential developed because it is not harnessed to a larger project. What then must the political prophets do? The political prophets must represent some of these innovations as a foreshadow, as a down payment, as a promise of a larger trajectory. In the Protestant Reformation, the idea of the priesthood of all believers was established. No intermediary between the priest and God. Now, what I believe as a radical Democrat is in the idea of the prophetic powers of ordinary men and women, to be vindicated through the transformation of our economic and political arrangements and through a radical change in the character of education. For example, no subject in any school, at any level of the system of education, taught just one way. Every discipline taught through at least two contrasting points of view. And it is by this combination of institutional innovations and changes in education and consciousness that I hope to see the substantial content given to the idea of the prophetic power of all men and women.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. Education is certainly something we're very interested here at the RSA, and there may be some questions about that. But in broad reaction to Professor Unger's talk, are there any immediate questions? And we're especially interested in hearing from any political prophets there may be in the audience, and maybe all of you, I don't know. Gentleman here.
Would you agree, Professor Unger? Sorry. I'm Derek Bates. I'm a scientist and author. Would you agree, Professor Unger, that nowhere in the world does true democracy exist? We have what we ostensibly call democracy that allows us to, once every 5 years in this country, to put a cross on a piece of paper, and then virtually we are powerless to influence the course of our lives.
Okay, thank you. This lady here, I think, had a question as well. I'm going to take them in threes.
Hi, so I'm live tweeting this event tonight, and I've got 2 questions for you from Twitter. The first one is from Travis Wentworth, who asks, can we have freedom and equality, or are they in conflict? Which is more important? Mm-hmm. And then the second one is, should it be the right of all to a safe and secure home, and why is the West not able to provide this?
Good questions. Okay. Is there a true democracy?
So, your statement about true democracy has 2 parts. And I agree with one part, and I don't agree with the other, or at least with the implication of the other. So the part that I agree with is that all the democracies that exist in the world are flawed, are relative. And their flawed character is manifest in their inability to master the structure, in their dependence on crisis as a condition of change, and in their consequent perpetuation of the power of the dead over the living. But there's a solution. The solution is to change the character of democracy through these alternatives that we have begun to discuss here. So the part of your intervention with which I do not agree is the implication that we are rendered impotent. We would not be impotent even if we lived under a regime of slavery and untrammeled absolutism. And we are certainly not impotent in the relative democracies that exist. There is an immense space of contradiction, a room for maneuver, a space that we waste by our confusion, by our waverings, by our failure to equip the will and the imagination. Hope is not the cause of action so much as it is the consequence of action. And we acquire hope by acting, practically or intellectually. Now, on this question of a secure place, indeed, we need, each of us, not just a secure home, but security generally in a haven of vitally protected interests. And one basic formula for an understanding of the alternatives is that the alternatives should give us this security and simultaneously render the surrounding social space plastic, open to experimentation. Just as the parent says to the child, I assure you of an unconditional place in the world, now go out and raise a storm in the world. That should be the relation of the democratic state to its citizens.
And this question about freedom and equality, is it a choice, or can we have both?
No, because really these are words, the meaning of which changes as we shift our assumptions about the structural background. So now there's this ideological landscape in the world in which the structural background is taken as given, at least until the next great war or the next great economic collapse. And then the issue is what has priority within that framework. As soon as we imagine the structural background to be up for grabs under challenge, this way of thinking no longer makes sense. If we begin to imagine cumulative changes in the economic and political institutions of society, it doesn't make sense to suppose that our objective is to maximize equality of circumstance or objective. Who would want to live in ancient Sparta? Forget about the Helots, about the slaves, just the Spartans themselves. No one wants that. What we want is an equality in a shared bigness, in a largeness of life, incompatible with entrenched social and economic inequality, but having a much larger significance. That's the true objective of the progressives. The true objective of the progressives was never simply to humanize society. It was also and above all to divinize humanity, to lift it up. So if freedom means bigness, if freedom is just another name for our power to transcend the context, then indeed freedom is the supreme goal.
Okay. This gentleman here, now we'll have this lady here and this gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. The National Secular Society is attempting to bring a court to the European Court of Justice against the coronation of Prince Charles and the Church of England's role within the coronation. Is this just merely two allies pretending to be enemies going at it? And if so, why? And if I can just ask a brief supplementary, you've talked about a skepticism about big blueprints. How do I know that bigness doesn't fall into that trap?
Okay, this lady here.
To what extent do you think the Freudian concept of the human being really limited what we could have done in terms of changing the structure? The reason I'm asking is, when I think back on the 20th century, it was very much influenced by the Freudian concept of the human being as really quite impotent in terms of escaping his or her own nature. And the nature is that of a very egotistical individual. And that has really influenced our whole economic structure. I agree fully with you. I think that we have great potential for imagination. So how can we imagine ourselves out of that perception?
Okay, thank you. Question, yes, please.
Is the tipping point very much nearer than you think it is? As we continue to print money and we abuse the whole privilege of money, therefore, will the structural change occur when really everybody realizes there's no value in paper money?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to ask you actually a similar sort of point. The current structure seems to have got away with this financial crisis pretty much unchanged, or underneath has a cumulative change begun?
So many themes. So let me start with this theme of finance. Let me take it in the American context that I'm more familiar with. And after all, the financial crisis did begin in the United States. The United States was the epicenter of this crisis. So here's an aspect of the crisis. In the closing decades of the 20th century, the United States developed, pioneered, a market in mass consumption goods. Towards the end of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the agenda of institutional experimentation narrowed to the point of focusing primarily on the popularization of access to consumption. Franklin Roosevelt was asked at the end of his life what book he would most like to see in the hands of every Soviet child. And he answered, the Sears Roebuck catalog. Now, famously, the United States underwent in the closing decades of the 20th century a violently regressive redistribution of income. How did the Americans manage to reconcile the market in mass consumption goods with this violent regressive redistribution? Part of the answer is that they reconciled these two achievements through a pseudo-democratization of credit, a fake credit democracy, in place of a democratized property-owning democracy, and made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And then, just as the United States used deficit-driven and credit-driven consumption as a substitute for structural change, for the broadening of opportunity, it found a convenient ally in China that used its exports of goods and of capital also as an alternative to the deepening and democratizing of its internal market. Thus, each major power in the world has conspired to avoid the imperative of structural change. Now you say it's precarious, but we know what history is like. The precarious can go on indefinitely. while our lives are consumed. So we will not be saved by the collapse of paper money. We will be saved only by ourselves.
And this question about Freud leading us down a blind alley in terms of time.
So I prefer to take this question in the spirit of not a commentary on Freudianism, but a broader commentary on the relation of these ideas to assumptions about human nature. Mm-hmm. So nothing in these arguments that I have made presupposes our ability radically to reinvent ourselves. What is human nature? So, on the one hand, there is nothing in our experience, not even the most intimate experiences, that is not colored and modified by the organization of society and of culture. We can't divide our experience into two parts and say there's a part that's invariant and universal and another part that is politically shaped. Everything is shaped to some extent. But nevertheless, it's not true that we are a kind of clay that can be freely remolded by the exercise of the will. So I prefer, in the spirit of a pragmatic experimentalism, to interpret human nature as what we are like now, and to understand that in committing ourselves to a course of transformation, we also commit ourselves to develop our humanity in a certain direction, slowly, marginally, over time. Classical liberal philosophy was premised on the false idea that there can be regimes that are neutral with respect to conflicting visions of the human good. There are no such regimes. Every regime tilts human experience in one direction or another. The illusory goal of neutrality gets in the way of the realistic goal of establishing regimes that, although they are not neutral, are broadly inclusive of contradiction, and that above all have the attribute of corrigibility. Karl Popper said of science that its aim was to make mistakes as quickly as possible. That, too, is one of the aims of democratic politics.
Thank you. Okay, we've got time for one more bank of questions. I'm going to take this lady here, this gentleman at the front. I'm going to take this gentleman here.
Thank you, Kelly Marie Blundell. I'm interested to listen, and I sit here and I nod along, and I think that the biggest fear I have is that we have a lot of conversations like this as progressive left, and yet we don't have practical applications. I'd be interested to hear what the practical applications are for bringing about the crisis, bringing about the movement that would exact change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it was this gentleman, the Francis.
You criticise the humanising force of political philosophy. I was just wondering what you make of the influence of John Rawls in left liberal political philosophy, given that he imagines some degree of structural change.
So let's begin with that question, huh? And then go to the other larger question, because it's a characteristic incident of contemporary intellectual life in these rich North Atlantic democracies. Now, the political philosophers, the philosophers of justice, not just the one you mentioned, but in general. The general situation is, for the most part, they all agree about the bottom line. The bottom line is some kind of liberal, institutionally conservative social democracy. They disagree only about the top line. In what prestigious philosophical vocabulary should this conclusion to which they are already committed be ornamented? Now, this is a kind of pseudo-philosophy. This is a perversion. It's a window dressing. It's a charade. It's not philosophy. What distinguishes these philosophies of justice is their combination of a putatively radical egalitarian commitment with a far-reaching institutional conservatism or skepticism. So if you join the two parts to each other, the explicit part about the egalitarianism and the covert part about the institutional conservatism, what results is this philosophical defense of compensatory redistribution through tax and transfer. That is the real program of these philosophies of justice. And that's why they're no good. They're no good for us. They're a pseudo-philosophy. They're a misdirection. Their flaw is made evident by their deficit of structural imagination. Now that brings me to the...
Just before
Yes.
you answer that final question, Flori, but I want to just bring in this chap, had a very quick question, and then we're going to finish on this question of practical
Yes.
change. That's okay, sorry.
Thank you. William Chan, one of your former students. Your comment about Sparta and also perhaps your dismissal of humanities as mere entertainment, I guess, struck me as a question about what do you think is the relationship or the role of the arts, the visual arts, the literary arts, in this seemingly politics-heavy vision of human life?
Thank you. I think we got it. So the visual arts, and then we're going to finish on practical change.
So the arts generally. So we have this situation across the whole field of the social sciences and humanities in which the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible is severed. To understand a phenomenon is just to understand what it can become under certain transformations or provocations. If we don't understand what it can't become, we don't understand it. We're simply retrospectively rationalizing it. And that is, for the most part, what the contemporary social sciences do. Now, in art, we get, as it were, a second chance, another eye, an intimation of possibilities that are suppressed in our experience and denied in our ideas. So it has a prophetic mission. And that brings me to your question about practice. I suppose I disagree with you. I don't believe that there are no practical applications. There are a multitude of practical applications throughout the world. What we have less of is the imagination of the direction, of where to go, of what to do next. No one can change the world just with ideas. But without ideas, none of us can change the world. In taking up the cause of ideas for the sake of transformation, we must confront another truth, which is that the world cannot be changed by the worldly.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. So many more questions, so much more discussion to be had. Professor Unger will be outside to sign some books, and I'm sure there'll be many people who'll be interested in delving into your ideas further. But this has been a great event. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for this discussion. And if we can show Professor Unger our appreciation for an incredible contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.